Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Adaam. Are you okay?
Yes.
Are you going to be okay today?
I did not sleep. I watched Interstellar last night instead of sleeping.
Okay, it's better than scrolling Twitter. That's a better use of your insomnia.
Well, it's not a great movie, but it's fun when you're just when you feel like some science magic.
Mm-hmm.
One of the themes of the movie is humanity trying to transcend its limitations and becoming 5-dimensional beings. And I was just thinking, for the love of God, we can't even agree to all wear masks during a pandemic. There's just no freaking way we're becoming 5-dimensional beings. Anyway, you need to figure out this segue because I'm too tired.
Okay, we're not going to transcend those limitations, not this week. Although our guest that we're introing today, she's kind of trying. She's trying to break the bounds of what is partisan media coverage these days,
or at least make fun of it.
Yes, exactly.
So we have notorious journalist Katie Herzog, who I loved reading as a blogger and reporter for The Stranger, Seattle's The Stranger. She now no longer works for them, but has her own, obviously, podcast with journalist Jesse Singal. It's called Blocked and Reported, and it's the perfect weekly digest of Twitter and online horribleness.
But Adaam, so I didn't know Katie before you introduced me to her, but the way you introduced me to her was she's very controversial. So
it's almost inexplicably so. You pointed out that she is kind of a great guest to have now as a mirror image to Michael Smerconish, who we talked to, I think, last week. He started entrenched within Republican politics and then got buffeted to the center. And Katie had a similar experience from the other side, mostly being pushed by people she considered her natural allies and friends. What happened to her is that she covered a story that, for her readers, seemed to tag her as a bigot. The crazy thing is, and you should read the articles for yourself to make your own judgment, but to my reading, she is the exact opposite of a bigot. She was writing a story about transgender people who have transitioned and then decided to detransition. And the fascination in the story is that it tries to give light to a marginalized group within a marginalized group. And again, to my reading, she did so compassionately. And still, that created a lot of political backlash from people, again, that she thought were her natural allies, the left, the LGBTQ community. And even she says herself in the interview, she understands where the concerns were coming from. It's the thought that by simply drawing attention to this story, you're giving fodder to people who really are trying to delegitimize transgender people. But in her writing, if you actually bother to read it, you see that she takes great care to do right by the trans community and to disassociate herself from any group that would try to invalidate them. But despite her careful journalism, and no matter how much she avers in her writing her commitment to what we consider liberal principles, she ended up being tagged by this meme as a transphobic retrograde monster. And that, while it made her no less committed to the liberal ideals of an open, free, inclusive society, it did make her, for the sheer volume of hate she received from her own side, more politically independent, which means less blindly committed to her own political tribe. Very similar, again, to the journey that Michael Smerconish underwent.
I think what's cool, too, about Katie's story is that what she did after this moment of kind of reckoning, and the way that she's kind of shaped her career and her storytelling now in a way that kind of embraces more kind of both sides of issues, and she is no longer afraid to talk to people on the other side and to have her viewpoints potentially like shifted or changed according to those kinds of more open conversations. I think that's what was really interesting to me as I was like researching more into her.
Yeah, we got to talk about that. We got to talk about how Twitter is turning our lives into a cold, sweaty nightmare.
Yeah.
And how everyone is performing horribly right now, and about sexual repression, because that's the only thing that really unites the left and the right. Oh, and I should say that this conversation was more explicit than our previous, more godly series. So if this bothers you, we sincerely apologize. These are no longer the 90s.
Yeah.
Oh, and one last thing. This, speaking of 2020, this was recorded before the most recent Trump development and his hospitalization in Walter Reed. Okay, enough disclaimers.
It never stops. But anyway, next up on Uncertain Things, Katie Herzog. Are you okay, Adaam?
Katie, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no problem.
I just want to put a disclaimer out there publicly that I'm coming out of the Yom Kippur fast, and I have only now just eaten something for the first time in the past 24 hours. And if I'm dysfunctional or if you hear me munching, I apologize in advance. And also, I have no idea why I'm still doing the Yom Kippur fast, but that's a whole other psychological treatise. So, Katie, what's on your mind?
Wow. Oh my God. What isn't on my mind at this point? I'm thinking right now specifically about Donald Trump's taxes. That has sort of taken up my mind for the last 24 hours.
Oh, wow. Your mind has room for non-culture war things.
This is a culture war thing. It always comes down to the culture war.
So put those dots together for us.
Right. Do tell.
Well, here's the thing. Okay, so the New York Times says this brilliant bit of investigative journalism. It should not take 4 years to get someone's a president's or a presidential candidate's tax returns, but New York Times, they do it. They get the tax returns, and I think there's an assumption by many on the left, a hopeful assumption that Donald Trump's tax returns are going to change anything, and I don't think that's true. Because I think that if you can hear a presidential candidate say something like, women, you just grab them by the pussy, and then you still vote for him, I highly doubt that the fact that the guy has used illegal tax loops, to pay as little as possible in his income tax is going to change anybody's opinion.
On the other hand, if the first thing is abhorrent to you and the second thing doesn't feel like much of a blip, maybe there is some sort of kind of inverse relationship. Maybe it is. Maybe it would be consequential to somebody who didn't care about the former.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe somebody will see this and say, like, that's the businessman for me. I also don't want to pay taxes. I'm going to vote for Trump.
I was actually some of the comments that I've been seeing on Twitter, which is certainly your domain, Katie, not mine. I stay away for the most part. Yes, but your podcast is actually wonderful because it gives me a digest and allows me to completely check out from the product. So thank you for that.
Well, good. You're welcome.
But the one thing that I did notice a couple of days ago is when it was coming out, it's some of the reactions are actually even questioning that it's not patriotic to the left. It suddenly cares very much about patriotism, so they're saying it's not patriotic to not pay taxes, and then in response you see comments like oh no, it's actually more patriotic to not pay taxes because you're outsmarting the big state.
Right, totally. Everything comes down to the culture war. I mean, I think there was at the beginning of COVID, a lot of people had the hopeful assumption that COVID was going to kill the culture wars. Well, no, COVID has done nothing but ramp up the culture wars. I mean, something like masks becomes a symbol in the culture war, which was totally inevitable. This is not a new thing. You saw this after 9/11. U.S. Republicans trying to rename French fries into freedom fries. It's not new at all. Yeah.
So let's dial back a little bit for our listeners. So you're one, I always think of you as in the bucket of some of the most inexplicably hated people online. Try to explicate it. Why are you so loathed?
Well, that's because you've never dated me. So it really comes down to one story that I wrote in 2017. So before COVID, I was a staff writer at The Stranger, which is Seattle's alt-weekly. And I started on staff there in 2017, but before I had started on staff, I was a freelancer. And I wrote a piece called The Detransitioners. And it was a deeply reported investigation into the lives of about 6 or 7 people who had transitioned from one sex or gender to the other and then transitioned back. And before that, I had really spent most of my career writing about climate change. So when I would get things like hate mail, it was mostly be from people who, thought climate change was a Chinese hoax or something like that. And then things really changed after that piece came out. And the piece itself was, I recommend people read it because the level of hate that I received after this piece was published was really sort of, it didn't make any sense when you consider what the piece was actually about, because the piece was, I went out of my way to sort of affirm trans identities. I had trans sensitivity readers, but there was this real backlash to the piece, and the backlash has continued for 3 years. So I don't live in Seattle anymore. But I went back there for the first time in about 3 months, 2 days ago. And I got off the bus, and the first thing I saw when I got off the bus was a sticker. And I've seen this sticker before. I hadn't seen it in this particular place, but I have seen this version of the sticker before. But there was a sticker on a telephone pole, and it said, "Katie Herzog is transphobic."
Wow.
And if you read the piece, that doesn't make any sense because there's no transphobia in the piece, but the narrative that sort of spread online, primarily from people who hadn't actually read it, but who have loud voices online, was that it was transphobic. And so I sort of got pegged with this reputation, I think unfairly, 3 years ago. And it really hasn't let up since then. And, just today I got in some sort of little Twitter spat with somebody, a trans person online who, accused me and my co-host Jesse Singal of being transphobic. And I said, okay, well, show me the evidence. Find the piece that's transphobic. Find the line of the piece that's transphobic. And she couldn't do it because it doesn't exist. I should be better about sort of ignoring those voices because I've been through this over and over, and nobody can produce any evidence to show my transphobia because there is none. But that's been sort of my life for the past 3 years since I published this piece, is battling this sort of false rumor that has spread like wildfire.
And how do you understand what they see, your haters see, when they say transphobic?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think what they're doing is signaling to each other, or signaling to their allies. And I don't think this comes from deep readings of the piece, because the piece itself really does actually affirm trans identities. So I think a lot of it is this, for lack of a better term, I think is virtue signaling, is this way of saying, I'm on the right side of history and this other person is on the wrong side of history.
But in a case like yours, this is why I'm so interested in this. Why would you cause such rancor? What about the fact that you even looked at the topic of detransitioning caused such an uproar?
Right. So that's a good question. So I think people who detransitioned are sort of inherently threatening to some trans activists, because if the reality is that some people who transition, it doesn't work for them. It doesn't alleviate their dysphoria. It doesn't make them more comfortable with their bodies. It doesn't make their lives better. And if they decide to detransition, then that could be an argument against easy access to healthcare for trans people. So that's sort of on paper. That's sort of what the argument is. That's why it's dangerous to these activists in particular to talk to detransitioners or to platform detransitioners, because they think that's going to be used by clinicians who are not in favor of trans healthcare, or legislators to deny trans people healthcare. And I think that's a legitimate concern. But my job as a journalist is not to acquiesce or to even help out activists. My job is to tell the truth about what's happening in the world, and this is a population that exists and is growing, and also deserves to have their stories told.
And what drew your attention to it originally? And also, did you have a sense that it's gonna be such a watershed moment for you?
I did know there was going to be a backlash. And part of the reason I knew that is because during the course of reporting the piece, I talked to some writers and clinicians who had worked with detransitioners, who had written about trans issues in a way that wasn't I would say 100% pro transition ideology. I'm not putting that well, but so I talked to people who'd sort of been through the ringer by writing about trans issues in a way that trans activists didn't like, and they told me what was going to happen. And I thought naively that the fact that I'm a lesbian and that I have lots of trans friends and have for the past decade and a half of my life, I thought that was going to matter, that would sort of be taken into consideration and people could see this is a good faith effort to get to the bottom of what is happening, of this phenomenon that is happening. And I was totally wrong about that. I was not just a heretic, I was a traitor. And in terms of what drew me to the story, so the first inkling that I had that this was a thing that was happening was through a podcast that I heard probably in 2016 or so. It was the show Levin-Areddy.
Yeah.
And so they talked to a woman who I've since become friends with, named Carrie Callahan, and she told her story, her detransition story, and it was just incredibly fascinating to me. And I started looking into it, and I saw that there was this online community of these people who sometimes, met in real life and sometimes just sort of existed as a community online. And I just found them fascinating. And part of the reason I found them so interesting was because these were people who oftentimes had, were terrified to come out as trans. They were terrified that their friends and families would reject them. And that hadn't happened. But when they had come out as detrans, it did happen. And I just found that so interesting, that they were shunned by their communities, but it wasn't for the thing that they thought was going to result in the shunning. It was from this other thing that they did later on. And the great irony here is that after I wrote this piece, the same thing happened to me.
Katie, can I ask you a question about this idea of platforming and what it means as like a journalist when you think about who you choose to write about and what is your responsibility or not to in the selection of the stories you choose and the people you talk to? How do you think about that and as it like intersects with this idea of platforming, which is actually a new term for me? I wasn't aware of it, but I get it.
Yeah. So I think people use the term platforming or journalists and media critics use the term platforming to refer to somebody that you have elevated by giving them a voice within some publication. And that is more often used with somebody from the New York Times will or the New Yorker several years ago, now infamously, David Remnick, the editor of the paper, was going to have Steve Bannon at the New Yorker Festival.
Steve Bannon is accurate.
Yes. And there was this huge backlash by a lot of people who had been invited to be a part of the New Yorker Festival, people like Roxane Gay and others, because they didn't want Steve Bannon to be platformed. As a journalist, I've always found that a little bit incongruent with the job. And here's an example for you. So the local NPR station where I live, KUW, the host of a local, call-in show several years ago, there was a guy who was downtown Seattle and he was wearing a Nazi insignia on his jacket or something like that. And somebody assaulted him while he was there. And the host of the show decided to have the guy wearing the Nazi insignia on his show. And there was a huge, huge backlash, major outcry. People, stopped donating to the station, lots of complaints. And he sort of went through this abject apology. He cried on air. He was abjectly sorry about this. And in my mind, it was sort of like, I want to know what the Nazi thinks, the same way that I want to know what the ISIS fighter thinks and the right-wing conservative thinks and the Antifa, I don't know if Antifa, if they have particular names in their organizations. I don't know what the hierarchy is, but I want to know what they think. And so for me, it's always seemed a little bit like, well, the job of the journalist is to sometimes, yes, platform people you disagree with, odious people, because we're trying to tell the world what people think. So it's not something that there are shows that I won't be on for various reasons or whatever. There are people I probably wouldn't have on my show. But this idea that you shouldn't platform people who have beliefs that you find odious, to me, that's sort of the antithesis of the journalistic mission.
What's frustrating about this and unsettling is that the rules are never clear. Because of course there is a market that seeks to satisfy the public fascination, the prurient fascination with extreme characters that are far outside the norms of society. And normally it's understood that whenever those characters are represented, they are not being endorsed by anyone. And yet, in some situations, when you interrogate or explore certain people in certain times, in certain outlets, then suddenly it is deemed, I don't know, counter-revolutionary or something. For David Remnick, it was Steve Bannon. For James Bennett, it was Tom Cotton. And for you, to some extent, it was Jordan Peterson, the controversial, best-selling Canadian psychologist and self-help guru whom you wrote about in 2018.
Yeah. Was it? I think it was 2019. Well, I wrote a bunch of pieces about Jordan Peterson, probably more than I should have. But there was one piece I wrote about Jordan Peterson was about a film that Peterson was made about Peterson. So this documentary, these Canadian filmmakers made this film about Jordan Peterson, and it got banned before it had been shown at a bunch of different venues. So there was a place in Brooklyn, I think, and maybe one in either Toronto or Montreal, that they were gonna do screenings of this film, and the staff members sort of said no, we don't want to be affiliated with this, and so the film was canceled. And I was on the phone with these filmmakers, and while I was on the phone with them, they got a text message from a pastor of a church in Portland who had agreed to show the film. And he sent them a screenshot of a message that he got from some local activist that said hey, we believe in the First Amendment. We believe in, your right to practice your religion however you want or whatever. We're also going to bring a guillotine to outside of your church if you have this screening.
Sounds reasonable.
Right. Totally reasonable. Right. To me, it was just this shows you what is wrong with the moment right now, which is you people who are mad about this haven't seen this documentary. And if you had seen it, you would see that it's actually not a glowing portrait of Jordan Peterson. It's critical in many ways, but you won't even watch the movie before you try to prevent other people from watching the movie. And it's fine if you don't want to watch the movie, but what I think that you shouldn't do is try to prevent other people from also following or force other people to follow your particular ethical compass.
And I think it's funny because also your pieces, to my account, of Jordan Peterson have never been, they're far from glowing. And
no,
in fact, some of the best, juiciest, most biting Peterson takedowns can be found in those very pieces that are considered Peterson apologia, if you actually bother to read them. You describe him as dull, as having bad ideas about women. You really make a point of listing everything that is banal, uninteresting, or pernicious about him, while also making the point that maybe, just maybe, presenting him as an alt-right recruiter is a bit hysterical.
Right. My basic take on Jordan Peterson is that he has been good for a select number of people. And I've met a bunch of people. He's been really instrumental in helping these people sort of, get off their ass and go get a job or start working out or whatever. That's good. But, I don't think he's a Nazi. And just by virtue of the fact that I don't think Jordan Peterson is a Nazi, there are stickers in Seattle calling me a Jordan Peterson apologist.
The pushback you got from the Peterson piece and the detransitioning piece, you imply that it had broader consequences than just some hate mail, which is to be expected. Some might say even courted. What were those consequences? What were the effects it had on your community, on your social interactions? How did it play out?
So after the detransition piece came out, there was a big backlash online, and some people who are big, let's say big names in sort of Seattle liberal circles, did like call outs, sort of the quintessential I am like calling you out on Facebook thing. And that had a big impact. And it wasn't just online. So there were all of these, like I mentioned, the stickers. People were burning copies of the paper and sending me videos of it. There was flyers at the coffee shops in my neighborhood and in the paper boxes that the stranger was in, calling me transphobic. So there was that, and obviously because of that, like people, including friends of mine, are going to sort of reconsider the value of my friendship because there's this guilt by association where, like, if you're friends with Katie Herzog, you must be a TERF or transphobic or whatever. Nobody has ever been able to like provide any evidence that I'm a TERF or transphobic, but the rumor lasts much longer than the reality. And so it had that sort of that social impact, and that was negative, of course.
Yeah.
But there was also this this positive impact, which is that it sort of it sparked this sort of change in me where I had been dogmatically of the left, dogmatically liberal. And I had this assumption that if there was some policy or some idea that was liberal, or we thought of it as liberal, I thought of it as liberal, then it was correct. And then when I started to see people passing on these rumors and sort of and oftentimes sort of lying about me and my intentions, I had this realization like, oh my God, like if my people are wrong about this, what else are they wrong about? And it took sort of, it has taken, I'm still sort of in the process of this. It's taken sort of years to sort of work around that. I mean, it hasn't changed the way that I vote. I still vote for Democrats. I'm a registered Democrat. But it has changed it has given me a level of skepticism about media and about other institutions that I really didn't have before. And but the real positive change is that it has also made me far more open to conversing with people who weren't like me. So in the past, before 2016, I didn't know any Trump voters. It's sort of like there's the like high school friend on Facebook or whatever, but I really didn't know anybody who wasn't politically just like me. And I sort of thought of that as a virtue. I was sort of proud of that. And I'm not anymore. And I've really gone out of my way to befriend people who aren't like me. And I think I've learned a lot more about the world.
It makes me wonder, and it's something that I've been thinking a lot about myself since moving to the U.S., which has I come from Israel, and you won't be surprised to know that America has a very different set of culture war in terms of the rules, in terms of the dynamics than other places in the world. And it was something that took me a while to wrap my head around. And it specifically in the past 5 years, there seems to be a growing industry on the right for that sort of appropriated the idea of tolerance and free speech, and to me it strikes a lot of it seems specious and griftery.
I don't disagree with that at all, and I'm concerned about it. Like cancel culture is something I've been writing about since before the name cancel culture existed. And now Donald Trump is talking about cancel culture, and it feels like this like underground band that I really loved, sold out. I hate that that free speech has become the mantle of the right. I really do. And I don't entirely blame the right because it's opportunistic, because they sense that this is a weak point on the left, because it is a weak point. And they sense that this is a way that they can sort of take up this cause, which I think that they're doing in some ways, unfortunately, successfully. Yeah, no, it's a problem, and I don't really know how to reconcile this one.
Right,
You know?
and my actual question is how. I guess you just answered it, but I'm wondering how are you able to tell? Where do you draw the line for yourself in terms of who are your genuine allies and who is just trying to recruit you to their side? I remember I think it was a PragerU video of Dennis Prager talking to Dave Rubin, who is the eternal ex-liberal.
Yes.
Who he will be like, it will be 10 years from now, and he will still be telling his enlightenment story about how he discovered, the follies of liberalism.
Yes.
And Dennis Prager actually says to him, it's valuable to us that you are a liberal or an ex-liberal. It's like that guy who would go on Fox as a guest for a year and would always have the Karen saying, ex-liberal slamming liberals. At some point, you're no longer an ex-liberal.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. And, I have that question about things like going on Fox News. I've been invited on Fox News a couple times and I've never done it. And I don't actually have a problem with people going on Fox News, like somebody like...
I just have to interject and say thank you for thinking more highly of us than Fox News.
I also did not go on the White Nationalist podcast that requested me. So I do have some lines. But, someone like Glenn Greenwald or even Bernie Sanders will go on Fox News. And I think that's totally fine because if you want to reach people, well, that's where the people are. But there is this, it bothers me when I've been bitching about something on Twitter all day and then I find out that Tucker Carlson has been bitching about the same thing. But the thing is, the reason Tucker is bitching about this is because it's a weak point on the left. So the reason he's picking up on this thing is because it is legitimately something that deserves to be criticized. In terms of who my allies are, I find pretty quickly that people who follow me because they think that or who follow me because I criticize the left will quickly unfollow me when they hear me criticize the right. And that's something that Dave Rubin doesn't do. My big problem with Dave Rubin is that he does the wrong thing, which is decide that the answer to the excesses of the left is to turn to Donald Trump, which is if you're worried about, for lack of a better term, this woke ideology proliferating on the left, electing Donald Trump is the worst thing you could possibly do because a lot of this is a reaction to Donald Trump.
I'm wondering too about there's a separate and related issue at hand. I feel like it's not just trying to isolate who are your allies on Twitter, but even in real life, in real conversation, I'm curious, how do you suss out when you're talking to someone that maybe you haven't met before or that you're not familiar with their viewpoints and everything? How do you kind of suss out the climate of the context enough to know what can you say and what can't you say, and can you trust this person to be kind of authentically who you are and have the viewpoint? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that is such a good question. Fortunately for me, I talk to very few people these days. I do most of my talking on podcasts and less of it in person. But that is a really good question. So I have I live in a small town, and so I used to live in Seattle, and I moved out to this small town about a year ago. And I have two neighbors who I'm close with. And one of them is an 86-year-old Trump supporter who wears an NRA hat all the time. And he has 200 guns in his house, literally 200 guns in his house. And we have nothing in common politically, but we both have dogs and our dogs really love each other. And on the other side of me, I have a sort of woke social justice, online, social media justice warrior who loves to tell me that J.K. Rowling is transphobic, right? So I think that I can, speaking with both of them, I think that I would probably leave conversations with both of them, with them thinking I agree with them. Because I'm able to bullshit in those conversations because within my personal life, it's just really honestly not worth it. But I think there are ways to sort of questions you can ask that sort of suss out what people believe in a way that doesn't totally give away your position. But I also think that it's worth remembering that, I think a lot of us live by the assumption that the people we meet and the people around us believe the same things that we do. And that may be true if you're a liberal who lives in a city, but I'm a liberal who lives in a Navy town. So I've stopped believing that. And I think that's actually been good for me to stop having this assumption that because I don't believe in God, the people around me aren't going to believe in God, because that's frankly not true in many cases in my
But to distill your argument or your solution, it's just don't open everything up with the people you meet.
Yeah, there are times when it's appropriate. There are times when it's not, and I have come to the conclusion, at least with the people who live directly around me, that oftentimes it is better to be a little bit superficial and agreeable, even when you don't want to be, just for the sake of like having a nice living situation.
That's so heartbreaking. It's just like, I for me as an Israeli, and I can't believe I'm actually starting as an Israeli, the idea of keeping some topics off the table for the sense of community or just like social cohesion is so sad. Like I made a note to myself as running through questions, is like that there's nothing more microaggressing to an Israeli than the concept of microaggressions. It's like this is the thing that nourishes us normally, getting into arguments.
Well, okay, so I've got a question for you. Okay, so a lot of the current leftist or left-wing ideology is very anti-Israel. So I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of sort of woke ideology has also proliferated in Israel as it has through many circles in Europe. So how does that work? Is there wokeness in Israel, and is it anti-Israel?
It's actually an interesting question, because there are two different ideologies that are both inherently anti-Israeli who have percolated into Israeli media and communication. Yeah. One is, yes, woke culture, and it's definitely taking over because we just copy all the bad ideas of the United States.
Yes.
And the way that this is reconciled is actually, there are two ways. One is I'm going to take the parts that I think apply to my normal life, which is, the sexism, the genderism, and there are racial issues in Israel as well. And they're profound and have real, sometimes segregational consequences, obviously. So some people who are focused on those issues will sometimes borrow some of the American language from woke culture and try to apply it, which could lead to absurd results.
Wait, does the term Latinx exist in Israel?
I can't imagine it does.
No, unfortunately.
You don't have any Latinxes?
We have more Latin than X's. So that's one, generally saying, sometimes comical solution for reconciling those ideas. The other solution is actually some people on the Israeli left have completely absorbed the idea that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, which is very, very interesting. Like it's not that surprising when you think about the self-annihilating instincts that you can see even in American liberals.
So are there people in Israel who argue that Israel should not exist?
Yes, absolutely. There are people who want to see maybe a one-state solution, which essentially means the eradication of any national identity and, potentially the rejection at large of the idea of a Jewish homeland. And that's the purified version of anti-Zionism. And you have Israelis who hold some version of this view. And I'm sure they have some arguments, but interestingly, there's another side of the culture, or the global culture, where I would say it's not just American, that is getting absorbed, and that is the nationalism conversation. And you can see how there is growing support on the right for ideas that should also be anathema to I would say the global Jewry, like Viktor Orban in Hungary. He's a hero on the left, and he's a hero on the right, in the same way that George Soros is no less a scapegoat in Israel than he is in Europe.
Is he?
Netanyahu himself, not to mention his toadies, love sharing their Soros memes. And perhaps most notably, Yair Netanyahu, the next in line heir to our current prime minister, long may he reign, has shared white nationalist memes so often that he was actually featured on the cover of the Daily Stormer once.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah. What's fascinating is just how malleable and spongy we are to some of the worst ideas out there from both sides.
And tribal. I mean, and it doesn't have to be within your sort of ethnic tribe. This tribal can also be your online allegiance or political allegiance or whatever.
So, and what do you make of that? That the allegiance is in a way, internationalist. Even the anti-globalists are globalized in their allegiances because you feel more in line with the right wing of the world and than you would with the lefties in your own country.
Sure. Yeah, I think people are looking for something. And I'm not a religious person by any means. I was raised by atheists. I've never been to a church service in my life outside of weddings. But I do think that at least in the United States, this increasing secularism does have some downsides. And one of those downsides, and this is not purely just about religion, this is also about the proliferation of the online and people not doing things like joining softball leagues or bowling leagues or whatever. But I think people are desperate for community. You look at statistics about just the amount of sex that young people are having compared to previous generations. And this is not just COVID related. People aren't having sex. They're not going out. They're not meeting each other. If they are meeting each other, they're meeting each other online.
Right. That's a Gene Twenge research.
Yeah. And I think that's, we're just starting to see the beginning of that right now. And you can see how this. I think there are countries in Asia who are a little bit more farther advanced on the path than we are, like Japan or Korea. And you see this disconnect, and it's the disconnect that creates this desire for meaning and this desire for inclusion and community. And this is the thing that causes people to join ISIS or to join, the Proud Boys or whatever, or to get online and just seek community. And we don't have that right now. It's a problem.
But how are we in a point where looking around and trying to make peace with your neighbors in order to build a community with them seems more unthinkable and untenable than looking overseas to forge an alliance with people you don't know and whose opinions maybe just a year ago you'd have considered vile?
Yeah, that's the question. How do we convince each other or convince ourselves to leave our houses and go meet people? I don't know the answer to that. And certainly a global pandemic doesn't make that any easier. But I think, if you live in it, before I moved out to where I am now, I lived in cities for most of my adult life. And if I lived in apartment buildings, I didn't really know my neighbors. You might say hi to them in the mailroom or whatever, but the people around you are virtual strangers. And, there are consequences to that.
And do you feel like you have a sense of community now on the quote unquote other side?
I mean, not, not really. I mean, since March, I've been basically quarantined. Right. I see my neighbor, like everybody else, I see my neighbors. I occasionally see friends from like a social distance or whatever. So we're in such a strange time. And I do have sort of community online in the sense that I have friends online, but it doesn't feel the same. It's not the same as like, and to be honest, like living in Seattle, when I did live in Seattle, there was not a lot of, I was sort of hated there by a lot of people. So I was in sort of a strange position where like people would find out my name and then all of a sudden decide that I was trash and not worth talking to or whatever. And so that wasn't, let me put it this way. It's been like several years since I've like really felt like I've had like good community in the world. But I'm also like, I'm married and I have have a dog and, that's all you need. I tell myself every day while crying into my pillow.
Did you actually have that moment in real time where you could see a person's reaction to you change when they realize who you are?
Yeah, I've had that happen several times. The one that stands out the most, I was at a bar maybe a year ago, not far from my work, just like waiting for the ferry. And I told someone that I worked at The Stranger, which is the paper that I worked for at the time. Which is the question that everybody asks, what do you do? And I said that I worked at The Stranger, and this woman said, "Oh, do you work with that transphobe?" And I said, "Yeah, I am that transphobe." And so I had that moment of her saying, "Oh shit!" And I said, "Did you, have you actually read my work?" She hadn't, but she left shortly after. We did not make peace, unfortunately.
And now you've turned digging into that morass dumpster fire of Twitter into your livelihood.
Yeah, that's sort of the funny thing. I got laid off from my job writing, and I started this podcast along with Jesse Singal, and I'm like making twice as much money as I ever had. And the best.
Tell us the secrets of the podcasting success.
It's just, it's all through Patreon.
Wow.
We're going to start doing ads. We're going to start doing ads, I think, in the next month or so. But right now, it's all through Patreon. And so I work literally one day a week. I have a 1 hour conversation with my friend Jesse, and then I edit the podcast, and that's my job. And
I was going to ask who edits.
Yeah. I do most of the Jesse edits the Patreon versions. I edit the longer ones, mostly because I'm more concerned, I think, about sounding like an idiot, so I want to have ultimate control over it.
How often do you find yourself fixing your misstatements?
Oh, every second. Yeah.
Well, what's the? I'm just sorry. This is just total like navel gazing. But what's the? What was the most embarrassing thing that you noticed that you said on your podcast that you had to cut out?
Oh gosh!
Or am I ruining like subscriber content?
Can I tell you? Can I tell you the most embarrassing thing Jesse said?
Pass the buck.
Well, can you? I don't know what the disclosure agreement between the two of you is.
I can't think of anything that I've said recently that was very embarrassing. But Jesse did have a really good joke about babies the other day. Like people who birth a child and decide that the child's going to be gender neutral, and then he asked me to edit it out.
Oh.
So I did it as a gift to him. I edited it out. It was a great joke, though.
Did you had to force yourself? Were you that close to just like sending release with the joke in?
Well, he gets the final cut. He's the one who uploads it, right. So couldn't have gotten away with it. And plus, I don't want him to get too canceled. I need him.
But I mean, this does bring up a point that I was thinking about listening to your podcast, is that you guys joke around a lot and you're very blunt with each other. And some of the humor comes in being just straightforward about things. And sometimes it's just, you like to joke around.
No, being straightforward is something that is very foreign for Vanessa. So
yes, definitely. I'm like, so Cuties is my middle name. But it strikes me that I realized listening to your podcast the other day that like, it's so rare that I hear people joking in this manner. It seems like it's like atrophying the skill set in America, and I'm curious what you think about that.
That's a great way of putting it. There is this lack of humor right now. I mean, there's a ton of humor. Like Twitter can be a very funny place. Comics can be very funny right now, but there is this sort of this fear of like stepping in a hornet's nest. And I think that there's like probably once an episode or once every episode, Jesse or I will say something that we say like during the editing process, like, oh, that's too far. And most of that is stuff that wouldn't have been too far, 3 years ago or 5 years ago. And so there's this constant recalibration about what's appropriate and what's going to get you in like real trouble and what's not. I got suspended from Twitter a couple days ago for making a joke about
Mitch McConnell. Adaam, did you hear about this? Can you tell the story of why you got suspended on Twitter, please?
Yeah. So right after Ruth Bader Ginsburg, after it was announced that she died, I had this image of Mitch McConnell just like smiling himself to death because this is like the best day of his life. So I made this joke about it, and then I followed up the joke by saying something like, "I'm not like." Obviously, I don't want him to have a stroke and die. I just want him to be brain dead. I'm not a monster. And the joke was like saying something monstrous and then saying I'm not a monster. That was the joke. Anyway, Twitter suspended me for 12 hours. A bunch of people like wrote me emails saying that I was a horrible person. They wanted to get me fired. So I tweeted saying like, well, if you want to get me fired, like you need to write like Jesse Singal, and I gave his email address. So I managed to at least attempted to ruin my co-host day as well. Didn't work, unfortunately. People were too lazy to actually email him.
Interesting, because the people who probably sent you an email about trying to get you fired are the people who will listen to Tucker Carlson talking about cancel culture.
Oh, absolutely. And so we had so there's this big controversy over this movie Cuties, And
it's really fun because it kind of like brings us back to the good old days when the right is responsible for puritanical panics.
Yes, exactly. And there was some, I think there was some overlap there. I did see some like good liberals like upset about the movie Cuties, and like lots of feminists upset about it.
Can you tell the story? Set it up.
Sure. So it's a French film that was released on Netflix, and Netflix did something very stupid. So the film is about this 11-year-old girl who comes from not Somali,
Senegal.
Her family, a Senegalese family. So like recent immigrants in Paris, and she's stuck between these two worlds of this like, Muslim patriarchal culture where she works a lot and she's considered a woman when she gets her period at the age of 11, and this Parisian Western world where it's this sort of hypersexual. So she joins this dance team, and there are these scenes in the film as a rebellion against her own family. And there's these scenes in the film where she's dancing in this, like, she and these other girls are dancing in this very suggestive manner. And so Netflix, idiotically, when they released the poster or whatever digital equivalent of this film, they released a picture of these girls wearing, sort of scantily clad, not in a way that actually would be different from any like dance troupe in America, but scantily clad, looking sort of suggestive. And then this someone, a conservative who was mad about the movie, posted a clip online of these girls twerking, so dancing in this like very suggestive manner. And there was this massive outcry, and Ted Cruz said that he was like writing the Department of Justice to try to get an investigation into Netflix. People were calling this child pornography. It's not actually child pornography. Like, there's no nudity, there's no sex. And the film itself is very nuanced, and the whole thing is a condemnation of the sexualization of children. But nobody had seen the film, but they got really pissed.
They also had psychologists working with the production every step of the way.
Oh yeah. They had like child psychologists on set. Like, none of it was like, the utmost care was taken to make sure these girls were not exploited. But the narrative became, this is child pornography, and these girls were exploited, despite the fact that most people hadn't seen the film, and there have been no complaints about exploitation. So Jesse and I talked about that. We watched the film, and we gave our sort of typical take, which is like, it's more complicated than the narrative online. And we lost a bunch of patrons. I got a bunch of people were like mad at me online. That was also because I tweeted like 15 times about how the problem with Cuties was that the girls weren't sexy enough and shit like that. Just because I'm a terrible person. And it was just like so enticing. This whole thing was people were so mad about this movie that they hadn't seen, and the same thing happened. Like, I just read the J.K. Rowling book that came out that people are all mad about because it's transphobic, and nobody had ever read the book.
This is like a constant refrain. I feel like in your podcast, like, but they haven't read it, they haven't seen it, they haven't, right? It's just like over and over again.
Yeah, our latest episode is about the J.K. Rowling book that people hadn't read but were sure was transphobic, and about a film called TFW No GF that a bunch of people are sure valorizes incels, and they haven't seen it because it's not out yet. So that's a lot of what we do, is like, I think try to calm down hysteria and moral panics about things that people have not actually exposed themselves
How's
to.
it going?
Good. Very good. Well, I mean, it's going well in the sense that like
you're making money out of it.
We're making money. It's not going well in the sense that we also live in a world where a lot of people like believe in QAnon, and if it's not QAnon, there's like, or believe that in like the Russian collusion, there's hysteria on both sides.
It leads us to a question that I really wanted to ask, but now I'm on a fork because I want to talk to you about sexual moral panics, but I also want to ask you about the stupidity on both sides, where to go. I guess it will converge in the end.
Yeah.
So let's start with stupidity. How do you draw the blind spots on the right and on the left right now?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think they're very connected, and I think sex is the commonality, right?
Yeah.
So not a lot. Okay. I have to be as politic as possible when I say this. I do think there was
because
an
you're nothing
element,
if not.
Right. I do think there was an element of moral panic around some Me Too cases, like the Al Franken case and some other cases that were sort of just believed to be true. And I think the same thing is true when it comes to this QAnon stuff. So in one case, it's believe the women. In another case, it's believe the children, although there are no actual children apparently who have been like harmed in the QAnon stuff. So I'm not sure how they square that circle in their minds. But I do think there is this, that's the commonality, is that there is this sort of paternalistic, believe that at least in the Me Too case, that, women are always victims. And I think you see that as well in the moral panic on the right.
And there is something on both those examples that you brought that justifies perhaps a paternalistic instinct. On the case of, save the children, let's put the QAnon extreme on the side. There is truth to the cottage industry of child abuse and child abuse content exists. And
right. They're in both cases. They're like Harvey Weinstein is real and Jeffrey Epstein are real.
Right. And it goes deeper, and I don't want to get too far into it, but it's beyond the specific characters of Harvey and Jeffrey. You needed to have institutional support to have allowed predators like Harvey Weinstein to survive so prominently and for so long. Like, the anger is not just justified, but overdue. There is truth to the need of, there needs to be an actual outcry to change some fundamental things in society to be able to hold people accountable for horrible behavior and of abuse, whether it's towards women, children, or whoever.
Absolutely. And there's this, like every good conspiracy theory, there's a nugget of truth. And then it just sort of creeps, it's concept creep. The fact that Harvey Weinstein exists and did terrible things, and the fact that Jeffrey Epstein exists and did terrible things is the little nugget of truth that allows the conspiracy itself to grow. And so I don't, and I think a lot of this it's cyclical and it's very human, and it's gonna continue to happen as long as our species exists. And I think we need to like grapple with that. The satanic panic was not that long ago. And these things happen within human culture, and you can recognize them. You can try to shield against them, but it's difficult to do.
I don't know if it's just my outsider perspective, but I feel like it's happening in American culture more often than the rest of the world. Yeah,
unfortunately, American culture has a tendency to spread.
Well, I actually just wanted to go back just to make sure I understood that, and so with the answer, your answer to the question then about the biggest blind sides on the left and the right. You think you do kind of target it in sex, just in different ways. Is that your answer?
Well, I don't know. So the biggest blind spots on the left and the right. I think the biggest blind spots are sort of more fundamental, and the biggest blind spot is a lack of epistemic humility, a lack of the awareness that you could be wrong, and I think that's also a very human thing. And this is something that changed for me over the past couple of years, because I was such a sort of diehard ideologue before the detransition piece and everything that happened, that I didn't have any concept that I could be wrong. And so I think that's the problem with any sort of any tribe, any political party, any movement, is this real blanket inability to consider the fact that you might be wrong.
How do we get there without having to be canceled first? Or is that the only way
That's
forward?
the question. That's the question. I think seeing other people be canceled who you trust like helps, but that's the question. I mean, there is this, I've talked to a lot of people over the years who have had similar political evolutions as I have. And the commonality is that we've all been accused of something that we didn't feel was right. And I don't know how you replicate that. I mean, the good thing is everybody's going to be canceled eventually, so we just got to wait it out.
We all have a clock ticking over our heads.
Yeah.
But I think that there's something beyond that. The fact that you just said it, that the fact that we all feel those clocks ticking, and whether that outrage is going to come from the right or the left, it's just a matter of time, is not just a matter of the epistemic arrogance on both sides, which I think is always the case when you have ideologues. But the problem is that everyone is an ideologue now. Like you have to belong to a political tribe. Otherwise, you're not in. Like, this is the biggest game on right now. It's the being in the rafters, shouting and rooting for your team. It's like everybody substituted their fun time for watching this single horrible sport with real life consequences.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing both sides can agree on is that the worst side is centrist. No, you're right. It has become sports. It's become drama. I think one reason I want Trump out of office, because I hope all of this will just cool down and people will stop caring as much. But the culture war stuff, how it fell into neat lines around COVID, where it became a culture war issue. And that's crazy. That is crazy, but also totally inevitable.
I loved how you brought up the Trump again in his ability to rev up the outrage, and you had a great episode recently about his decision to issue the political writ against critical race theory and how bad an idea that is, and not out of particular love for critical race theory, but out of the understanding that Trump putting his thumb on any scale will mean that there is going to be a rallying on the other side.
Yeah, it's about the backlash. I'm opposed to critical race theory in the government. I'm opposed to critical race theory in education or business. First of all, I'm not sure that I want any president in the business of dictating what businesses, what sort of trainings they can do in the first place. But my bigger concern is that anytime Trump does something, he's what law is it? Every time Trump does something, there's an equal and opposite reaction. All Trump banning critical race theory from the government could possibly do is make people more determined to institute critical race theory in the government when he's out of office. Which is a problem.
And it's also just another proof that for so many people who participate in this sport publicly, including the president, it really isn't about implementing real social changes, but just getting that extra point on the scoreboard, that this little win in this asinine culture war, even if it comes at the expense of actual policy.
I just have one last question for you, Katie.
Sure.
So I'm curious, do you have plans for election day? If you do, what are they? And what advice do you have for the rest of us of what we should be doing on election day?
God, I haven't even thought about it. I have no plans for anything.
Fair enough.
If in a different timeline, if we were in the midst of a global pandemic, things might be different. But I probably will be at home with my dog and a bunch of weed. Although actually, wait, shit. All right, I'm going to quit smoking weed and I might be sober.
Oh,
that's going to be difficult. Yeah. I mean, that would be my advice to people who aren't quitting weed, is to stock up on your from your local pharmacy.
What convinced you to quit?
So I realized that I've never, I started smoking weed when I was 12. And I smoke I smoke daily. And I realized recently that means that I have never gone through an extended period of sobriety in my life, in my adult life. And that seems like something you should do at least once in your life, right?
Do you feel like there's a haze that you want lifted, or is it just intellectually you want to experiment with sobriety?
It's more an intellectual experiment, but I'm curious if I will have more ambition. And if I will desire to do things like at this point, I work one day a week and I spend the rest of my week just taking my dog for walks and smoking weed, and basically acting like a teenager without a job. And so I'm curious to see if this will change things. So it's an intellectual experiment with maybe, hopefully, some productivity on the other side. We'll see. We'll see how long it lasts.
I personally miss your long form writing, so
thank you.
I'm putting one vote into that side.
Thank you.
Just an extra final question. I really want to know, what's the stupidest thing that you had the pleasure of covering?
Oh gosh. There's so much. There's so much. I've covered so much stupid shit. There was one of the early cancel culture stories I wrote was about an eatery in Portland where this guy had been at this restaurant, this cafe, and there was somebody sitting beside him who was wearing a German Air Force shirt. The Luftwaffe, I believe it's called. Is that the correct name?
Sounds right.
Something right. And so the historic, so this is still the German Air Force logo. It's like an eagle with like under Nazi times it would have had a swastika in its claw, but it's just sort of the the
in the good old days.
Yeah, yeah, in the good old days, sure. And he saw this guy wearing this shirt, and he complained to the manager, and the manager, who was the owner of this business, it was a couple that owned it, and he wouldn't kick this guy out because he said, freedom of speech, he can wear whatever shirt that he wants. And so this guy, he went home and he got online and he wrote this Facebook message about it. So there was this boycott of this restaurant. Well, it turns out that the restaurant was it was owned by a Jewish woman, and it was named after her grandmother. Her grandmother who had fled the Nazis in Poland, and she had she had been like stopped by these border guards, and they asked her. She was trying to prove that she was like Ukrainian or something like that, and they asked her to say the name duck in Ukrainian, and she said this word like Bob. I don't remember the word. She said this word. And they let her go because she guessed right. Wow. She spoke the right language. So this was the the genesis of this name. And this guy had a boycott, because he didn't like the shirt of the guy sitting beside him, and he started a boycott of a Jewish restaurant. There's just some like very delicious irony there.
That is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well. On that joyful note.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you guys for having me. It's good to talk to you.
It was fun.
It's awesome. Yep. And go keep on making sense in the world.
Oh, thank you.
I hope that's not copyrighted by Sam Harris. Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Share with your friends and enemies and rate us kindly. And until the world ends, stay sane.